famously said, "Man does not live by bread alone." We see not only through Jesus, but all the Holy Scriptures in the Old and New Testament, a pantheon of who's who engaged in the practice of fasting from food. Moses on Sinai fasted from food. Elijah fasted from eating. The Apostle Paul, when he encountered the risen Christ, fasted for 3 days. You might wonder, is fasting a commandment? Here's my take on that. When you look at the Sermon on the Mount, and this is in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus says in Matthew chapter 6, verse 16, when you fast. He's not commanding fasting, but he is putting fasting in the same breadth of understanding as the practice of almsgiving and the practice of prayer. So praying, almsgiving, giving money, giving oneself to the poor, and fasting are all recognized practices that we find in the Gospel of Matthew. Down through the years, fasting has been a great part of Christian tradition, especially in the season of Lent. For Lent, that is the time of year for Christians, that is the 40 days leading up to what we as Christians believe is the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. And that is a period of fasting. It's a time of training and discipline. In the early church, it was a time of training and discipline for new Christians that were coming into the faith. And so Lent, at the very beginning, was a time of fasting and discipline. For the Roman Catholic Church, it has been the tradition to not eat meat on Fridays. That's a form of fasting. Lent has been a time in the life of the church of our training, going without so we can grow more deeply into the experience of Jesus' walk to his death. Now it's interesting, during the Reformation, and that's the period in the history of the Christian church when there was a schism in the church over theology in the 1500s in Europe. There was the spirit of the Reformation, and I'm thinking primarily of Martin Luther and John Calvin, who felt that the discipline of fasting, of self-denial, these ascetic practices had lost their focus and purpose. That instead of fasting being a means for people to grow closer to God, that fasting had become a way for people to justify their sinful behavior. So, for instance, you could go and do bad things, but as long as you fasted, then you were okay with God. Well, the Reformation leaders, Calvin and Luther, felt this was wrong. This was a kind of perversion of what the true intent of fasting was all about. In fact, in 1522, the civil authorities in Zurich, Switzerland, banned the Lenten fast because of that reason. So what about fasting today? Let me suggest this. The single most important reason for fasting is an opportunity for us to grow closer and deeper to God. Many of us today as Christians realize that we live in an increasingly godless society. And in a place where God is pushed to the margins, we live in a culture that glorifies the self and encourages a glorification of the self. That's what I mean about all those fast food restaurants that cater to our every whim and desire. Every consumer good has a way of focusing attention upon ourselves, our needs, our wants, our desires, wanting to scratch every itch. And what we know as people of faith is that a life lived in bondage to ourselves and to our egos is a life ultimately that leads to disappointment, to disillusion, and to despair. Our greatest hope for a full and abundant life is a life lived in God. My question and challenge, and it really is a challenge to all of us in the Christian faith, is if we lose the practices of faith, practices like fasting, which help us become more mindful of God, then how can we still claim to be Christian of being mindful of God in our lives? Whether it's fasting, or it's being generous with our money and giving back to God, whether it's our service to humanity, whether it's taking time for prayer, spiritual discipline, and meditation, all these are ways that we come to know God and know the joy that God can bring into our lives. Being intentional about what we eat and what we don't eat. If need be, passing up Wendy's and McDonald's from time to time so that we can have more room for God in our lives is the path to deepest satisfaction. Perhaps the most important phrase when I think about what fasting means and the opportunity for fasting in our faith is the phrase that Jesus said when he was in the wilderness, when he says that human being